What really happens inside a coffin after it's lowered into the ground? It's a question people have asked for centuries, but no one dared to answer until now. In this true scientific experiment, a team of researchers led by Dr. Laura Evans set out to uncover the unseen, not for spectacle, not for fear, but for truth. With the help of a terminally ill man named Thomas Reed, who offered his body in the name of science, they placed a high-definition camera inside a real coffin, recording every second from burial to decomposition. At first, what they saw was expected. Stillness, silence. But then, something changed. Lights flickered, sounds echoed, movement. Thomas Reed had always been a man of quiet conviction. At 78 years old, he had spent most of his life in greenhouses and forests, studying plant life with a kind of reverence that others reserve for holy books. A retired botanist with no living family and no lingering attachments, he had come to terms with the inevitable far earlier than most. When doctors diagnosed him with a terminal illness, he didn't panic, didn't beg for miracles. He simply asked if there was any way his passing could serve a greater purpose. That's when he was introduced to Dr. Laura Evans and her team. Their project had been circulating in academic corners for months, always whispered, never spoken aloud in formal circles. The idea was as bold as it was controversial: place a live camera inside a coffin to record what happens from the moment of burial onward. It wasn't about sensationalism, they insisted. It was about data, about helping forensic science, environmental research, even modern archaeology. But ethics boards had pushed back hard. Disrespectful, some said. Morally questionable, others argued. What finally tipped the scales was Thomas himself. When asked why he was willing to participate, he simply smiled and said, "If death is where we're all going, someone ought to at least take a look around." His acceptance of mortality wasn't just brave, it was contagious. Even Dr. Evans, seasoned and skeptical, found herself moved by his calm. On the day of his burial, the atmosphere was both clinical and reverent. A small team stood by with quiet restraint while Thomas's plain casket was lowered into the earth. There were no television crews, no social media announcements, just a man giving his final gift to knowledge. The camera, no larger than a coin, had been securely installed inside the casket's lid, angled to view the full interior. Its feed was encrypted and relayed wirelessly to the lab above ground. Power was supplied by a micro-generator designed to last weeks. Once the dirt settled and the world went silent, the experiment began. In the lab, a row of scientists sat facing a wall of monitors. The main screen displayed a still, sterile view. The fabric lining of the coffin, undisturbed and perfectly lit. Notes were taken, settings double-checked, and for a while everything remained calm. Too calm. Dr. Evans expected nothing different. The early hours would be uneventful. Biological processes don't announce themselves with the fireworks. But what no one in the room said aloud, what each of them felt just under the surface, was the weight of where that camera now was. No human eyes had ever stayed in the grave. No one had watched from the inside. It wasn't the darkness that unsettled them. It was the silence, the waiting, the sense that they had just cracked open a door that perhaps wasn't meant to be opened. And yet, it had begun. Thomas had given his death. Now it was their duty to watch it, to honor it, and to learn what death had to say back. Hours passed. The lab remained dim, lit only by the steady glow of monitors and the soft pulse of blinking indicators. On the main screen, the coffin's interior remained untouched. The smooth fabric lining, the pale sheen of the burial shroud. Nothing had changed. It was exactly what the team expected, and yet, not at all what they felt. The silence on the feed became deafening. Every flicker of the screen, every mechanical hum in the lab seemed louder against the absolute stillness of the image. There was something deeply unnatural about watching nothing happen inside a space that was never meant to be seen. Dr. Evans sat with her hands steepled, her eyes unmoving from the footage. She wasn't waiting for a ghost, nor expecting theatrics. But still, something inside her stirred with unease. Scientific rigor demanded patience, and the team was full of trained professionals. But this wasn't just another controlled environment. This was a coffin, underground, with a camera inside. And the man they had come to respect, to care for in some small human way, was now lying motionless just beneath the surface of the earth, wrapped in silence, darkness, and the weight of their expectations. One technician whispered, "It's almost too quiet." Another responded with a nervous chuckle, "What did you think it would be? Fireworks?" But no one laughed, because they all knew what he meant. It was the kind of quiet that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were the one doing the watching. Dr. Evans reminded the group that this phase of the process, decomposition, microbial activity, any detectable changes, wouldn't happen quickly. "We're not here for theatrics," she said gently. "We're here for truth, and truth unfolds slowly." She returned to her notebook, recording timestamps, light conditions, internal temperature. Everything was stable. Everything made sense. But in that very stability, something began to shift in the room. Tension, anticipation, even fear. The human mind isn't made to stare at death this closely for this long. Some part of it begins to look for movement, for meaning, for answers, even when there are none. One assistant stepped away from the monitors, needing air. Another fidgeted with his pen until it snapped. And all the while, the coffin remained perfectly still. Yet the air in the lab felt heavy, thick, like pressure building before a storm. Around the 6-hour mark, Dr. Evans leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing slightly. Something just at the edge of perception had shifted. A flicker, a blur. She didn't say anything yet, not out loud, but she marked the time and watched, and waited. Because if there's one thing she had learned in years of research, it's this: the things that change everything often start in silence. And this silence had begun to hum with a presence she couldn't quite name. The screen remained still, unchanging, but the room no longer felt the same. Something somewhere had shifted, and no one could explain why. It was Michael who first noticed it. The youngest technician on the team, sharp-eyed and usually silent, leaned forward with a subtle frown on his face. "Did anyone else see that?" he asked, barely above a whisper. At first, no one responded. Most assumed he was referring to a software glitch, a buffering hiccup on the stream. But something in his voice made everyone pause. Dr. Evans turned her chair slightly, eyes narrowing at the screen. "Rewind it," she said. Michael moved quickly, dragging the timeline back by a few seconds. Frame by frame, they watched the moment again. Stillness, stillness, and then, there it was, barely visible. A faint flicker on the lower right edge of the coffin's interior. Not a flash of light, not a full distortion, just a tiny shimmer, like the way heat waves ripple through air. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. "Could be signal interference," one of the researchers offered. But even he didn't sound convinced. They checked the diagnostics. Nothing was wrong. The transmission was stable. The power flow uninterrupted. No external interference, no power surges, no temperature fluctuations. Everything, on paper, was fine. But Dr. Evans knew better. She leaned in, hands resting on the console. "Mark the time. Note the coordinates of the flicker." Her voice was calm, but her fingers tapped lightly on the desk. A rhythm not born of nerves, but of anticipation. This was something. Not enough to draw conclusions, but more than nothing. And that was the danger. Because science doesn't react to flickers. It demands evidence. Yet the room was no longer operating on logic alone. Something had shifted, and every person present could feel it crawling beneath their skin. They resumed the live feed. Once again, the image on the screen was perfectly still. A quiet coffin interior, untouched and dimly lit. But the energy in the lab had changed. Even without words, they were all silently asking the same question. What caused the flicker? And was it going to happen again? For the next hour, nothing occurred. The screen did not change. The light remained soft and steady, but the mood in the lab was different now. Thick, watchful. It was no longer the beginning of an experiment. It was the beginning of a story, a mystery unfolding pixel by pixel. Around the 8-hour mark, another technician began to feel lightheaded and asked to be excused. Dr. Evans nodded silently. She wasn't surprised. The tension was starting to wear on all of them. not because of what they saw, but because of what they couldn't see. The flicker had cracked something open, a doorway perhaps, or a threshold. And though the footage returned to stillness, the lab did not. No one left early, no one spoke loudly. They just kept watching, waiting, writing, because something had touched the edge of the lens, something they couldn't explain. And deep down, every person in that room knew. They hadn't seen the last of it. By the 12th hour, fatigue had begun to settle in. The monitors continued to glow with the same unchanging image, the interior of a coffin that looked no different than it had hours before. The air in the lab had grown heavier, not from lack of sleep, but from something no one could name. And then it happened. Not on the screen, but in the speakers. A sound, soft, almost fragile, like the tip of a fingernail brushing gently against wood. It came once, just once, and then silence. Everyone froze. Heads turned, no one moved. Then again, a tap, slightly louder, rhythmic, purposeful. "That's not static," Michael whispered. No one corrected him. The room shifted into a hush so deep it swallowed breath. The tapping continued. 3 soft knocks, evenly spaced. Then a pause. Then again. Dr. Evans stood slowly, her eyes locked on the monitor, even though nothing had changed visually. "Amplify the audio," she said quietly. The technician adjusted the levels. The tapping grew louder in the room, enough that it seemed to echo off the lab walls. It wasn't random. It didn't resemble the shifting of soil or the settling of wood. It was deliberate, too measured to be natural, too steady to ignore. "What are we hearing?" one assistant asked, his voice cracking under tension. No one answered, because no one knew. Dr. Evans tilted her head slightly, listening not just for the sound, but for the silence in between. It wasn't just noise. It was communication, or the attempt at it. "Log the timestamps, record every sequence," she instructed. Her tone was calm, but her hands were trembling slightly at her sides. The knocks continued for another 20 seconds. Then, nothing. Total silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, not passive, not peaceful. It felt charged, pregnant with meaning. Something had broken through, something had made contact. "Could it be an environmental shift?" someone asked, almost hoping for it to be true. "Air pockets? Ground compression? 12 feet underground in sealed clay?" Dr. Evans responded gently. "Highly unlikely." No one spoke after that. They simply returned to their chairs, eyes on the screen, ears tuned to every possible variation in sound. There was no movement in the coffin, no flickers, no shroud displacement, just a steady image in the memory of the knock. The lab was no longer operating as an observational hub. It had become something else. A temple, a waiting room between worlds. They weren't just watching death anymore. They were witnessing its voice, its rhythm, its presence. Dr. Evans wrote quietly in her notebook. 12:03 a.m. Knocking begins, rhythmic, human-like. No equipment errors detected. She underlined human-like twice but didn't dare speak it aloud, because speaking it would make it real. And no one in that room was ready to call it that, not yet. Not. But inside each of them, something ancient stirred, a realization that the line between data and mystery had just begun to blur, and it had started with 3 soft knocks from the other side. The room held its breath long after the knocking had stopped. No one dared speak. Even the softest whisper might shatter the fragile layer of disbelief that kept them sane. The screen remained unchanged, a still, softly lit interior of a coffin, the burial shroud resting where it had always been. But everyone knew it now held weight, the kind of weight you couldn't measure in kilograms or volts. It was presence, tension, a shift in atmosphere that logic couldn't account for. Dr. Evans stood motionless, her eyes scanning every pixel, every shadow on the screen. The diagnostic readings continued to return normal. No seismic activity, no pressure change, no hardware malfunctions. And yet, something was different. At hour 16, just as exhaustion began to cloud focus and routine had lulled a few of the assistants into mechanical repetition, it happened again. This time, not a sound, a movement. The shroud shifted, slightly, gently, but undeniably. "Did you see that?" someone whispered, though everyone already had. The fabric lifted no more than an inch before it settled back into place, like something underneath had risen just enough to breathe, and then stop. There was no airflow down there, no animals, no mechanical interference. The movement was organic, too precise to be dismissed as coincidence. Michael rewound the footage, played it back in slow motion. Frame by frame, the burial cloth rose and fell like a chest inhaling once, then stillness. The lab was silent. No one typed, no one scribbled notes. All eyes were on the monitor, now no longer just a screen, but a window into something they didn't understand. "There's nothing under it that could move," one technician said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Nothing left alive." Evans said nothing. She merely leaned closer, her face pale but focused. "Replay it again," he instructed, slower. The playback revealed no external cause, no visual distortion, just a steady lift, then fall, as though the air itself had thickened and then released. The team sat in a tense stillness, scientific minds at war with human instincts. They had signed on to observe decay, decomposition, data, not motion, not signs of life, or whatever this was. Then the whispering began, not from anyone in the lab, from the speakers, faint, too faint to catch words, but unmistakably human in tone, a murmuring, low, irregular, garbled as if underwater. Dr. Evans gestured for audio enhancement. As the volume increased, the whispers remained unintelligible, yet more haunting with every repetition. They weren't random. They had rhythm, breath, pain. One of the researchers pushed away from the table, his chair scraping across the floor. "This isn't possible," he muttered. But no one contradicted him, because they all felt it now. Something was trying to speak. Not through the equipment, through the phenomena, through the coffin itself. Dr. Evans gripped the edge of the console. Her mind still clung to methodology, but her body, her senses, those had entered another realm entirely. The realm where science begins to tremble before the unknown. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't sure if she wanted to know what came next. By the 24th hour, the atmosphere in the lab was no longer scientific. It was sacred. Unease had hardened into something more primal, something the mind tried to suppress but the body could no longer ignore. No one had left the room, not to eat, not to rest. The screen had become their altar, the sound their liturgy. The footage showed no dramatic shift, no sudden flash, but it was what wasn't happening that unnerved them. After the whispering faded, the coffin returned to silence. Too much silence. Not passive or peaceful, but waiting, watching, like something aware of being observed. Then, without warning, the feed flickered. Not like before. Not a soft ripple. This was jagged, abrupt. The screen went black for 3 full seconds. When the image returned, the shroud was no longer smooth. It had been pulled tight to one side, creased and twisted at the corners, as if by invisible hands. Robert Evans stood without a word. The technician beside her leaned in closer and froze. "Zoom in," she ordered, her voice sharp. The screen magnified slowly, revealing the disturbed fabric. And then, something else. Faint, almost imperceptible. On the underside of the coffin lid, a word, forming slowly, not scratched or burned, but as if moisture had gathered in deliberate patterns like condensation on a mirror. The word was free. It appeared one letter at a time, fog-like, and then held. No one spoke. No one moved. There was no airflow down there, no condensation-producing elements, no mechanism to form writing of any kind. The coffin had been sealed, sterile. This was impossible. "Is this a malfunction?" someone whispered. But the diagnostics were clean, the temperature consistent, humidity levels unchanged. It had no explanation, only presence. "Replay the moment just before the flicker," Dr. Evans said. They rolled the footage back. The fabric had been undisturbed, the coffin lid blank, then darkness, then the word, free. The silence in the lab was suffocating, Not a single voice argued for a rational cause this time. Something beyond their understanding had left a mark, not just on the screen, but in the minds of every person who witnessed it. "What does it mean?" a technician asked quietly. But even he knew the answer wasn't one they were prepared to hear. "Doctor?" Evans wrote the word in her notebook slowly, almost reverently. This was no longer about decay, no longer about process. It was about meaning. And whatever intelligence had formed that word was trying to say something, not just about death, but about what might exist beyond it. Then came the final whisper. Unlike the others, this one was clear. "Thank you." It came through softly, as if from a distance, but unmistakable in tone. Gratitude, a farewell. And as the team stared, the screen dimmed once more. The camera shut off, not abruptly, not in error, but smoothly, purposefully, like a door being closed from the inside. No signal loss, no power failure, just absence, the kind that says, "This part of the story is done, and the rest is not meant for your eyes." By hour 30, the lab was a cathedral of disbelief. The image on the monitor was gone, no flicker, no corruption, just a clean, intentional black screen. The team tried everything. Diagnostics ran flawless. Power supplies remained active. No interference from external signals. The feed was simply off, but it was how it ended that gripped them. The whisper, soft and human, saying "thank you," followed by the word "free" dissolving from the coffin lid like breath fading from glass. Dr. Evans sat still for a long time, staring into the dark monitor as if she could will it back. She wasn't trying to recover data anymore. She was searching for something else, something unmeasurable. Truth, meaning. They had set out to observe the physical journey of a body after death. What they got was a confrontation with mystery. Not myth, not metaphor, but a pattern of events too deliberate to ignore. Scientists debated in hushed tones across the room. Maybe the shroud had bunched from gas buildup. Maybe condensation had formed letters by chance. Maybe the voice was radio crossover. But no one believed those things. Not really. Not anymore. There's a point where explanations become excuses, and every person in that lab had crossed it. Dr. Evans finally stood, walked slowly to the whiteboard, and erased the list of expected data points. Rate of decay, temperature drop, microbial markers. In their place, she wrote 3 phrases: knocking, movement, word. And then she circled a final word beneath them all: intentional. "We document phenomena," she said without turning, "but what we witnessed goes beyond process. We saw presence." For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they disagreed, but because they all knew she was right. Whatever had happened beneath that earth was not random, not technical. It had rhythm, response, emotion. "Do we publish this?" someone asked finally. "Would anyone believe us?" Dr. Evans turned slowly, her eyes calm but piercing. "It doesn't matter what they believe. It matters that we witnessed it." And in that single sentence, the entire room shifted, not toward fear, but responsibility. Because once you see what others cannot, you carry it differently. The scientists stayed for hours afterward, reviewing every piece of footage, every sound file, not to find a flaw, but to understand what had been given to them. And through that process, something quiet bloomed between them. Reverence, not for death, but for what might lie just past it. The idea that consciousness might not end when breath does. That something, call it soul, energy, or simply awareness, lingers long enough to say a final word. "China, thank you." Not out of superstition, not out of fear, but as a release, as if something once trapped had finally moved on. The coffin remained buried. The camera never reactivated. But the lab, the people inside it, and the very purpose of their research had changed. They didn't witness decomposition. They witnessed something trying to speak. And now it was their duty not to explain it, but to remember it. Because silence, once it's broken, leaves an echo that never truly fades. When the image returned, it wasn't with a warning or a technical glitch. It simply reappeared as if it had never left. But what the team saw made them freeze where they sat. The burial shroud was no longer smooth. It was pulled taut to one side, creased and bunched unnaturally, as if gripped by invisible hands. And then slowly something began to emerge on the wooden lid of the coffin. At first it looked like moisture, soft streaks forming in the grain. But those streaks took shape, letter by letter, not scratched, not etched, but formed, as if pulled from the air itself, as if condensed by sheer force of presence. The word was simple, final, free. The room went cold. No one spoke. Dr. Evans leaned forward, her knuckles white on the edge of the desk. One of the technicians stood, his chair dragging loudly across the floor, but no one flinched. It wasn't fear that held them, it was awe. The kind of awe that crumbles the boundary between science and soul. This wasn't a data point. This was a message, not metaphorical, not imagined, visible, measurable, and yet completely unexplainable. One scientist whispered, "It's impossible," but his voice barely registered. Everyone was still staring at the screen, where the letters remained for a moment longer, then slowly began to fade, as if evaporating back into the wood grain. The shroud loosened, the lid was once again bare. The silence returned, thick and reverent. And then the voice came. Not a whisper this time, not ambient noise, a human voice, strained but clear, spoken from somewhere deep. "Thank you." That was it. 2 words, final, grateful. The camera cut out immediately after. No static, no power loss, just black. This time they didn't try to restore it. They all sat, unmoving, eyes wide, hearts racing. Dr. Evans finally exhaled and said quietly, "That was intentional." There was no dissent, because deep down, every person in that room had felt it too, that this wasn't something they caused or captured. It was something they were allowed to see. The word, the voice, the patterns, it all pointed to something not trapped, not tormented, but waiting for someone to notice, waiting to be heard, perhaps even waiting to be released. "We were never recording decomposition," Dr. Evans said softly. "We were bearing witness to a departure, a journey no one had seen before, not from the outside. And the one inside the coffin, he had left them a message. One word, free. That word would live longer than the experiment, longer than the footage. It would echo through the lab, through every lecture, every paper, every retelling. Because this wasn't about ghosts, it wasn't about fear, it was about presence, a presence that acknowledged its watchers, that said goodbye in the only way it could. And that left not with screams, but with grace. Thank you, a soul's final note captured by a machine, but remembered by hearts that would never be the same. No one left the lab, not even to eat, not even to rest. The screens were now blank, but the weight of what they had seen still pressed heavily on their shoulders. For 48 hours, they had observed something that should have been sterile and lifeless, only to encounter a message, a presence, and what felt unmistakably like a farewell. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of sound. It was loaded, electric, like the final pause at the end of a symphony. They had all heard it, not an error, not a glitch, a voice, human, a goodbye. Dr. Evans sat motionless, staring at the screen that once displayed the inside of a coffin. Her notebook was open in front of her, pen still resting against the page. But there were no more words to write. What could be said? What could science possibly conclude when the laws it had always relied on failed to explain what had just happened? The voice hadn't just spoken, it had responded. It had acknowledged them. It had known they were there. Why am I here? Not the question of a decaying body, but the plea of something aware. Thank you, not the phrase of a spirit trapped in torment, but a final note of peace. A release, and that word on the lid of the coffin, free, it hadn't been scratched or painted. It had appeared as if the soul within had been waiting for one last act of recognition. One final audience. Was it a cry, a celebration, a message for the living or the dying? Dr. Evans didn't claim to know. None of them did. But they all agreed on one thing. They had witnessed something sacred. Not in the religious sense, perhaps, but sacred nonetheless, untouched by human expectation, unspoiled by scientific arrogance. A moment that would not repeat itself. A gift that could not be measured. When the technician finally shut down the feed, it was done with quiet reverence. No one moved to erase the data. No one debated publishing. There was no rush to explain. They just sat, each one processing the enormity of what they had seen. And beneath that awe, something else had begun to grow. Not fear, not confusion, but clarity. For the first time in their careers, they understood that some knowledge does not exist to be dissected or categorized. Some truths only exist to change you. And they had changed. The lab, once a space of logic and calculation, now felt more like a chapel. The equipment, more like relics. The team didn't just document an event. They bore witness to a soul's final message. And it wasn't for science. It wasn't for fame. It was for them. For all of us. Proof that something endures. That something abucks, even when all seems lost. That even in death there may still be a voice. Whispering not in terror, but in freedom. In peace. In release. The screen may have gone black, but none of them would ever see darkness the same way again. Some experiments are designed to answer questions, but a few rare and sacred open doors we didn't know existed. What began as a scientific inquiry into decomposition ended as a confrontation with the unknown. In a world ruled by logic, these researchers encountered something unmeasurable: presence, intention, even gratitude. The coffin did not just hold a body. For 2 days it held a message, and it was heard. This isn't about ghosts or superstition. It's about honoring the possibility that consciousness, in some form, persists beyond our definitions. That death may not be the end, but a moment of unveiling. And maybe freedom. As you walk away from this story, carry with you not the fear of death, but the humility of what lies beyond it. For the question is no longer what happens in the coffin, but are we listening when something speaks from the silence? Stay open, stay aware. The veil may be thinner than we think.